trying to remember the road. I can't remember the exact.
Okay, let's see the next next slide. Okay, what's the next slide? Let's go back.
This looks like a before shot, and I think this, I'm not even sure where this is at now. This is again along the transmission line, a winter shot, and I think the next slide is an after shot, and you'll see that all of the wooded buffer is now missing, and you could look straight across again. That looks like it's about 150 feet over to the other side where there's more housing.
And the trees that were cut down were on Con Ed's property? Or was
well, in this area, I'm not sure where this exact one is, but most of the time the trees that are cut are in fact in their right-of-way, or so it's either their property or the property that they have easement access to. There have been occasional events where the contractors have gone onto private property and removed trees right along the edges of the right-of-way without proper notification.
Correct.
Now, who makes that determination? Because I know in Yorktown there's been an issue as far as property lines. One homeowner said...
Con Ed does, yeah.
Well, it's supposed to, according to the PSC, before any action occurs, these right-of-ways are supposed to be fully surveyed before each cycle of coming in to do any kind of vegetation management. But as we've seen in many cases, they are not in fact surveyed ahead of time.
It needs to be pointed out that Con Edison and Public Service, as a federal regulatory body or regulated by a federal agency, they have to go through a legal process in the state of New York called a SEEKR process, which is an acronym for an environmental review process, before they do anything over 10 acres. And the Public Service Commission did not do that. They will argue that they did in 2005, and what they did is they used what's called a short form. And a short form is just that. It exempts the agency or any organization that wants to change the environment in any way. They have to make sure there's no environmental impact. If they think there might be an environmental impact, they have to go through a process called an EIS, an environmental impact study. And then from there, they have to do a DEIS, which is the draft of an environmental impact study. The Public Service didn't do any of that. They used the short form because they maintained they were going to be working on fewer than 10 acres, which is obviously wrong. And the short form exempts this kind of vetting process, and then they just checked in the short form that there's no environmental impact. And
what's also somewhat problematic about this is, first of all, I don't know if you gave the number, but it's 190,000 acres across the state, which I did some quick calculation. That's about equivalent to 3/4 of the acreage of Westchester County is basically being clear-cut across the state.
So think about that. So they said they're going to work on fewer than 10 acres is what they said they were going to do. What they're looking at is 190,000 acres.
Wait, 190,000 acres is
across the state.
Across the state under transmission lines.
Okay, so if we have an aerial view of the transmission lines, we're looking at the right-of-way.
Yes.
We're looking at the lines,
right.
And then looking about 100 feet left and right.
Anywhere from 50 to
200 feet. You're talking about 190,000 acres. And the Public Service said we're only going to be working on less than 10 acres.
And one of the things about
this, it's not, but it exempted them from any kind of a vetting process about the environmental impact of what they're about to do.
They are their own, by state
themselves.
law, they're their own lead agency, and therefore what they say goes.
Right, they're policing themselves.
One thing about the environmental impact statement and analysis you're supposed to do is look at alternatives to what you're proposing, and also examine mitigation for that which you can't change, remedies for the actions that you don't have any alternative to. But none of that was done, and none of it, of course, was done in any sort of a public forum. In fact, there was basically no public notification of this original short form seeker being approved by the PSC. And since then, they used it to overlay all activities since 2005 forward along the transmission lines.
Let's step back a second. Mm-hmm. The Public Service Commission is elected? It's an elected body?
No,
it's appointed by the
governor?
It's appointed by the government, by the federal government.
No, by the governor.
By the governor.
And so the governor has a say over the...
The governor has, Yes, there are, in fact, his Department of Energy or Department of Environment, I'm not sure which one is the one that specifically oversees or is able to oversee the Public Service Commission. There's also an oversight function within the Assembly and within the Senate at the legislative level. There's committees that oversee the PSC directly.
So what has been their reaction?
Well,
Let's start with the PSC. What is their...
first of all, we have to say what happened was that, because maybe people don't realize exactly that, last week, a little over a week ago, the Westchester County Board of Legislators passed a moratorium resolution, which basically said, as we said before, please stop the work for a while so that we can open up the guidelines to public review and discussion, and let's get them changed to be more in conformance with environmental needs that everyone sees now. What happened was, in fact, that Con Ed said, we don't have to follow this because basically we're still under the Public Service Commission's regulations that tell us to clear cut. The Public Service Commission right now is kind of ignoring it. They haven't come out. They know they have to deal with it, but they haven't made any determination yet how they're going to respond to it.
But in the meantime, they're still clear cutting. And when you approach Con Ed, they say, we take our marching orders from public service, and that's it. So they're ignoring the moratoriums. Well,
you have to see that, I mean, in defense of Con Ed, because a large corporation, they don't want to be fined the sort of fines that they can be fined not only from the PSC, but from the federal government level if they stop clearing without being told to, because they're now in breach of their line maintenance requirements.
So Con Ed's kind of in a catch-22. Under the law, they're supposed to clear cut, but then there's supposed to be environmental studies, which they haven't been following.
Which never happened.
Well, it's even a little bit more, not to browbeat Con Ed, because in some cases they are caught between a rock and a hard place. But in their actual implementation of their vegetation management along the transmission lines, they don't even follow their own policies in terms of notification, in terms of trying to take care of a tiered management where trees, as you move further away from the transmission lines, you can allow taller trees to exist because they won't have any risk. So they don't even follow their own guidelines.
Let me ask you a question about that, because I know you have federal guidelines.
Yes.
Correct? Where you're talking about they're supposed to cut the trees or any incompatible vegetation that's underneath the transmission lines. But then as you extend outward, then they're allowed to, under federal regulations, to trim the trees. Am I correct?
Yes.
They can be taller as they go further out.
It's somewhat, it's not clearly stated how you approach it, but it's definitely stated that you don't have to have the same degree of removal of, all height down. It really says as you get further out, you can make selective removal of incompatible species from the areas along what's called the border zone.
What we have seen, all of that notwithstanding, Dan, we've seen with this clear cutting under the transmission lines, they just take everything. I mean, it's like they burned it, and they just take everything.
Can we see some more slides? Because I think we should see an example of this if we could.
I think they have to go back and take a look.
Okay.
There's no selective removal. It's all gone.
So what do you say to someone who's not affected by this, and they say, look, I don't care about the trees. I want my electricity.
Well, everyone wants their electricity. As I tell my wife, everyone wants their iPod. But the real problem is that even if you're not, well, first of all, let's talk about what happens to those people. They have real property value impacts from the loss of the trees that create aesthetic impacts. They have basically what could be looked at as some health impacts, such as
that slide right there.
Yeah, well,
and they have other kind of impacts. There's no more noise abatement. There's no privacy barrier from like headlights of the cars. There's impact on flooding and erosion.
Right. I would tell that homeowner that next time you try to get on the Sprain or the Bronx River, you're not going to be able to because it's going to be flooded.
Well,
and